Hi everyone, this is Daniel Storage, and I'm going to be giving you just a brief presentation on noun class specific adjective acquisition in children. I know that name seems a little overwhelming and perhaps pretty unintuitive, but it's actually not as complicated as it sounds. I'm going to flesh it out kind of in the next few slides, and hopefully it'll be clear. So before I actually tell you what we're looking for, that is what our research question and hypotheses are, I want to go over the phenomenon on which this research is based. The research project that I'm presenting right now is largely based on the work done by Dave Barner, a developmental psychologist at UCSD. So he did a study that I'm going to call the Pimwit study. And basically what he found was that children make judgments relative to noun class. So as an example of this, because that's pretty abstract, you see on the left you have a small car, and on the right you have a large rat. This is kind of how children think. They would label the car as small and the rat as large, even though the car is actually much larger than the rat. See, they judge relative to the noun class, car versus animal. So now we're going to take a closer look into exactly what was done with these Pimwits in Dave's study. So these are what we call Pimwits. We have 5 Pimwits here. In Dave's experiment, children were simply told, touch the tall Pimwits after being introduced to these figures. Thus, a child would probably choose the Pimwits that were located on the very right and second from the left, and label them as tall. Adults would probably respond in a similar way. So the question then arises, what would happen if you added a few small Pimwits to this selection of Pimwits and asked the same question, please touch the tall Pimwits? Would it have any effect? It shouldn't, but would it? Now what would happen if you added a few much taller Pimwits? Would that change the decisions that children were making on the height of these different Pimwits? So the answer to all these questions is yes. Children do change the decisions they make on Pimwit heights based off of the distribution of Pimwit heights that's presented to them. So it's a little complicated. Let me flush that out. So you see in this image here, we have on the left the 5 Pimwits we had before. Same height. Note that the heights have not changed at all. It's the same 5. And on the right, we have 3 new Pimwits that are very short relative to the others. So whereas before, children would probably only choose the 2nd and 5th position Pimwits as tall, they may now include the 1st and 4th position Pimwits as well. Because of that widening spectrum, that larger distribution that they now have. They have more information to look for. Note that the middle, the 3rd position Pimwit, before was considered very short, and now might be a moderate height. So now let's switch things up a little bit. Before, we had 8 Pimwits of differing heights. Let's take those same 8 Pimwits and just change the last 3. Let's change them, add little hats to them, call them Tolvers. So now let's say we present these to children, these 8 things of 2 different groups, 2 different noun classes. The 5 on the left would be Pimwits, and the 3 on the right are Tolvers. So let's say we present these to children and we say the same thing. Pick the tall Pimwits. The question is, would changing the label of the last 3 Pimwits from Pimwits to Tolvers change the decisions kids make on what is considered tall? The answer to this question is actually yes. So whereas before, in the last scenario on the last slide, the 1st, 2nd, 4th, and 5th Pimwits would be tall, now it would go back to more like what it was before, where the 2nd and 5th Pimwits were the only ones that were considered tall. So now that we've gone over what Dave's done in his study, let's move over to the present study, what I'm going to be doing in my honors project this year. So my research question is this: does this phenomenon occur with color as well? So that might be a little more abstract in color, and the next slides will be devoted to kind of showing you what that would look like as a task if you were going into the experiment and what it would mean. But the question stated abstractly is this: do judgments on color that children make vary based on the distribution of colors presented to them? I know that's really complicated and it might be a little abstract, but hopefully over the next few slides that might make a little more sense. So now my study will have two tasks. The first thing we're going to do is replicate, hopefully, Dave's study with height. The second will be to create a new study with color being the main task, to see if the results mirror that of height. So here's what a task would look like for a given individual participating in my study. So you walk in, you greet the experimenter, and you're presented with a card that looks like this. Or it might be a different object, but for our purposes right now, let's just go with squares. So now the researcher would look at you and ask you, please, can you pick the red squares? What would you say? You would probably choose the top right, the bottom right, and the middle left. Maybe one or two of the other ones, depending on the person. So this is just what one person would see. Now let's take a look at what another person would see. So here we go. Here's another distribution of colors. This is what another given individual would see. So not the same child asked twice. This would be between subjects, not within. So now you'd present this new distribution of colors to a child and you would ask, once again, can you tell me or can you touch the red squares? So now you see that the judgments you would make would probably be different. You would probably choose the bottom right and the top left as red. Now note that the top left square was in the distribution in the last slide as well, but you didn't select it as red because you had more red, more saturated squares already there. But now that you have more yellows and less reds, now it's red. So now here's the last example I'll present you with. So this is another stimulus that a given individual participating in our experiment might see. So we see here an entirely different distribution of colors, for the most part. Instead of a lot of yellow that we had in the last slide, now we have a lot of reds. So what would you say if I asked you, pick all the red squares? You would probably pick that middle line, right? Or at least most of those colors. Now here's the interesting thing, and this is what we're looking for. In the top left, note that that's the same square that was in the top left in the last slide, which you called red. What we're looking to find is whether or not individuals would now call that orange instead. So now, what are we looking for? What's our hypothesis? Essentially, what we're hoping to find is that color will show the same effect as height. That is, color judgments will be noun class specific, and I'll flesh that out in a second. So remember in the first study by Dave Barner, the Pimwit study, we found that these judgments being made by children differed based on the distributions of heights presented to them, and based on the noun classes presented to them. So remember, Pimwits and Tolvers, the addition of Tolvers changed the decisions they were making. So our hypothesis is that the same will be true for color. The same will be true, that is, people will make different decisions on color distributions based off the labels of those different categories and the color distributions presented to them. So now really briefly, I just want to go over a few seconds on the methodology. We're going to be testing this in children and adults. That is, we will do both of these tasks in children and both in adults. Remember that we're going to be replicating the Pimwit study and then moving on to color. Now, to do this, we're going to be using Mechanical Turk. If you don't know what Mechanical Turk is, it's essentially an online tool that we can use to create surveys and have people answer them so they don't have to necessarily come into the lab. Now we are planning on having them come into the lab anyway, but it just gives us a more controlled way of doing it with adults. Now we're going to be hopefully controlling for monitor size. We're going to hopefully have most people do it on MacBook Pros of a certain, without going into too much detail, a certain resolution and a certain brightness. That way we can really look at the colors themselves and the effects they have. So now I hope you have a pretty good idea of both what we're looking for and how we're going to find it. Remember, we're looking whether, to state it abstractly, whether children make noun class specific judgments on both height and color. We'll be replicating Dave's study with height and reproducing it with color. slightly different variation, but hopefully attaining the same results. So I hope you've enjoyed this presentation, hope you've learned a little bit about the research I'm going to be doing, and I hope you find it interesting.